Now it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Dean, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Geological and Environmental Science here at Hope College. And Sarah's life story and mine are, in this Halloween season, spookily similar. Sarah got her bachelor's degree here at Hope College in geology, which I also did. Then she went on to Houston and obtained her PhD in earth science from Rice University. I spent some time at the crosstown rival, University of Houston. And then she went off to the Permian Basin, which is in West Texas, and worked as a production geologist for Shell Exploration and Production Company in Midland. And I spent some time in Midland, but working for Exxon. So it's, I told you it was spooky. So, well, Sarah's going to talk to us about what the frack is fracking, and I guarantee you it's going to be a blast. So take it away, Sarah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. This is working. Hello. Yes. Fracking. Very brief outline, but I've kind of already done the who am I. I know there's been some oil and gas classes, but a little bit of recap for how do we get the hydrocarbons, and then the discussion of the unconventional, which is the ones that we frack. How it works with a potentially working demo that's thawing on the counter. And then some talk about, again, the controversy over fracking. What are the risks, the rewards, and where do we do it? And questions can be at the end, questions can be in the middle. I have lots of stories from Shell that I don't have pictures that I could take away, so I'm happy to chat about them if you have a question that I have an example for. I'll bring those up. Yep. I was here, I left, I came back. So I did work in the Permian Basin. I actually worked in Houston, and then occasionally got to visit Permian Basin whenever we were doing jobs. And then I did move to the Gulf of Mexico after 3 years, so I worked the conventional fields as well, a lot less successfully. And then came back here in 2020 to teach oil and gas formation. So if it's oil and gas, it was originally an ocean or a lake. So it was originally a body of water. If it's coal, it was originally terrestrial. So terrestrial organisms, land, plants and critters, swamps, will, as they get buried and compressed, they'll turn into a coal seam. Aqueous, generally ocean, but lakes occasionally make, if you have something the size of Lake Michigan, it counts, right? Those, as they die and rain down on the bottom of the ocean floor and decompose, and if you build up a big enough layer, will eventually become oil or gas. The tricky part of that is how deeply do you bury it? So in this case, we keep getting buried by other sediments. And eventually, as we get buried, we heat up, right? The geothermal gradients, so the increase with heat in the earth as we go down. And then we convert all that organic matter to kerogen. Eventually, the kerogen becomes oil and gas. And liquids and gas don't like to stay in the subsurface being squeezed by the resulting rocks above them. So they become mobile. Coal can't do this, of course, but that's the advantage of oil and gas, is to become mobile and, of course, buoyant and go up and out of the reservoir for the most part. That's also why they're cleaner than coal, because coal, as a solid, right, all the junk that is in there with the organic material stays. So when you burn that, you have a lot of other stuff that you're burning off too that turns into pollutants. Hydrocarbons take less of that with them when they exit the reservoir. Gas, even less of that. So when they say something, natural gas is a cleaner fossil fuel than coal, it's not clean, it's not green, but it's cleaner because it leaves a lot of things behind. So another very similar diagram. illustrating kind of the same basin process on the one side, but temperature is kind of increasing as you go down. And in green here, it's called the oil window. So at depends again on what the geothermal gradient is for that particular basin. They vary. But generally, a couple of kilometers down, you will right, turn that kerogen into oil. There is some gas that goes with it, but then if you keep burning it, right, then we go from the oil to the gas window. And so which phase of hydrocarbons you get in the rock is directly related to how deeply it was buried. The source rock, which is source, again, just where the original sea layer of sediment was, and then how deeply it got buried. And of course, if you exceed the gas window, you're overcooked and you're no longer useful. And the fun thing is with this is sometimes, again, because these can move, right? The source rock might be overcooked, but at one point it was in the oil and gas window. And those hydrocarbons, if they moved out in time, right, then they're somewhere in the rock above it that we can still get at them for conventional oil and gas. So yes, you get to that point of overcookedness around 250 degrees C. Generally at that point, you're post-toasted and no longer exploitable for oil and gas, in particular because we go to the source rock for fracking. We need that to still be in the oil or the gas window. Conventional oil and gas can, if it's moved out, great. We don't need to necessarily worry about where the source rock is at the present day, just where it was in the past. Conventional oil and gas, you need to worry about that. It needs to still be in the oil window or the gas window. Busy diagram, but kind of mixing my conventional and conventional production here, and then we're going to separate them after this. So we need a source rock. So we need that original marine layer that was organic rich enough, right, that it produced hydrocarbons. Conventional oil and gas then need to get it out of that rock into, again, a sandstone or something with porosity and permeability, which I'll talk about in a minute. And again, because they're mobile, they exit and they go up until they can't anymore. And that's where you have the cat rock or the seal, keeping that in the subsurface. Otherwise, it would go all the way to the surface, which it does in some places where you've got oil oozing out of the ground or making slicks on the ocean floor as it oozes out of the bottom of the seafloor. We also, those are actually extremely helpful in prospecting for oil and gas. So if you want to know, is there a working hydrocarbon system in the basin without drilling a well? Because that's expensive. So we'll look for those seeps and those slicks on the water surface and say, all right, is there a working system? And then you go look for the other components and say, you know, is it economic? So I digress. It does, well, there's various things in the Permian Basin, but anybody's been to Midland and tasted the tap water, it's horrendous. And that's in part because it's a very leaky system. So we do trap a lot of hydrocarbons underground. Some of them also make it all the way up and into the aquifers. And there's a lot of evaporites out there as well. And that also gets sometimes into the water. Friend of mine who lived out there fed their plants. She never told me what type of plant it was, the tap water, and it started growing like stalagmites off its leaves. That's what she told me at any rate. I never verified it for myself, but I did drink the tap water on my very first trip out there, because the hotel, you know, we were leaving at some ridiculous 4 a.m. or something, and she, you know, they were closed, all the breakfast area, but she went and got me a hot cup of water so I could have tea, and then I tasted it. My drilling engineer was laughing at me the entire time because I had to politely sit there and drink it because she'd done extra work to go get it for me. And now I realized why we had bottled water on the rigs. So at any rate, that's an example when, again, a lot of times, and that gets, actually, we'll come back to that for the controversy piece, because a lot of times things aren't perfectly sealed and they can get up to the aquifer levels before fracking even takes place. Now, does fracking make it worse? We'll get there. I'll talk about this. This really goes back to more the normal oil and gas, where you need those fluids or gas to have moved in the subsurface, get trapped somewhere. Salt is what we have in the Gulf of Mexico because salt is a perfect seal. And so things get trapped up against salt. They get trapped in folds. They get trapped in faults if the fault seals. They get trapped by shale layers. So there's that is the one bit we don't need for unconventionals. So that's a really big part of the traditional geologist oil and gas. It's just go look for the traps. Do we have an area where it's been stored underground? And that part we just kind of throw back out the window when we go for the unconventionals. And so that's kind of the division of labor. I spent a lot of work on traps and seals when I worked in the Gulf of Mexico, because we knew we had a lovely carbon system. We had a source rock, it expelled lots of things, but did any of that get saved somewhere, or did it all go to the seafloor and we lost it? So that was sort of the Gulf of Mexico big prospect of, could we find where it stayed underground? Permian Basin, I never even considered that in the kind of the fracking unconventional world. So what's the difference? Yep, the conventional, again, here is kind of our source rock, our shale, our marine layer that was buried in this case, in this basin, quite deep. I'd be a little worried about that one if it was going to be overcooked, if that actually had a depth scale on it. And right, so it did expel some amounts of hydrocarbons, and this is what's happened in the Permian Basin, right? There was in the 70s all this conventional work for oil and gas. So there was a whole lot of drilling and all these sandstones up there, and the nodding donkeys are still out there eking out like a barrel a week, not very much production from those wells if they're still producing. But we did have that. And then unconventional, when we say unconventional, we mean many different things depending on who's talking. So you could mean coal bed methane, which isn't have anything to do with oil and gas because it's coal. But that there's associated methane with a lot of coal seams. And so sometimes you go in after the gas instead of after the coal. I don't tend to do that in this country, but Australia does some of this, and some other countries do more of this. This one, Canada does some of this. I had a colleague who worked Canada Shell who told us a lot about it. You're very close to the surface here. You're definitely flirting with the aquifers. And it's a gas, so if you accidentally fracture the surface, that gas is then going to the atmosphere. So coal vein methane has some extra risks that would make me nervous. So I never desired to work on a coal bed methane play. And then what more people think of when unconventionals is the shale and sands. So tight sands, what are some of the other names? Tight sands. Yeah, that's the main one. Oil shale. So what differentiates these from these are still filled as the hydrocarbons leave the source rock and go on their path up. But their properties are such that if you drilled a normal oil and gas well and you stuck it in them, it wouldn't be economic. The properties are just not good enough. They don't flow hard enough. And so we actually develop them the same way we do the shale, which is the source rock. And that was sort of the big idea somebody at, well, several people, but thought of, well, okay, right? Yes, a lot of that oil and gas has been expelled and gone up to the surface. Some of it's still in the rock. And why don't we go after that? And that's where the oil shale, the unconventionals really comes from. And then the techniques that going after the source rock, well, let's go after those sands that have properties more similar to the shale than our conventional reservoirs. We'll use the same techniques on those. And so it really is a very different, again, because they are seals themselves. There's so not flowable, if I want to say it that way, that geologic time will still tend to get hydrocarbons in them or remain in them in the source rock. But yeah, we needed not conventionally productive economic. So I've mentioned porosity and permeability. I should actually define them. So porosity, simply how much void space is in a rock or a sediment. So the empty space. If you're below the water table, this is generally filled with water. If you get into a hydrocarbon system, right, that water might also have oil and gas. So different phases will stack on top of each other. If you have all three, gas will come to the top, then oil, then water. So having the gaps is helpful, but that's not enough. They need to be connected. And so that's what the tight sands are kind of in the middle category here. So no porosity, no permeability. Salt does this. Igneous, so volcanic rocks, metamorphic rocks, crystalline rocks with basically where all those pores have been squeezed out or grown together. Again, salt is a crystalline rock as well, even in a different process. And then you can have some porosity remaining. So as it was buried and compacted, didn't quite fill in all the pore spaces. Some of it was left, but it's very disconnected. So a tight sand might do that, where it has some room, those hydrocarbons can move in, but it's not well connected enough that it will move extremely slowly. And so if you drill a well in that, and you might be waiting and waiting and waiting, and those hydrocarbons are not flowing in because the connections aren't there. And then of course, porous and permeable both has the porosity, has the void space, and it's connected, the permeability. Should say porosity we generally give as a percent. So 20% would be excellent for a reservoir rock. Permeability is length squared, so millimeters squared, micrometers squared. It's very difficult to measure in the lab. I have my students doing it in hydrology connected to aquifers, and you can estimate it, but it's not a fun value to get at because of course your grains are all different sizes, and so it's really an estimate that we can get. But go. This is just an example. This is just a kind of a curve for a regular shale of decreasing porosity. We're going from like 60% to 5 up there with depth. And again, you could kind of start, yeah, we're in kilometers, so 4 to 6 kilometers, right? You could start being in the oil window, depending on your geothermal gradient. So you've really squeezed most of your porosity out at that point. This is for just for a shale. And so obviously there's lots of different curves, lots of different rocks, and different basins. But that, if I'd proposed a conventional well to management with that kind of porosity, I would not be getting it approved. So these got sort of microscope-ish pictures, microscope proxy for what a reservoir might be like for, again, shale, so the unconventional, sandstone, the limestone, which are two big reservoir rocks for conventional geology. Yay. So we produced a well in one of those, right? Flowable hydrocarbons, right? Because we have that connected porosity, permeability. Whereas in the shale, you stick the well down and nothing's happening, right? It still has some of those hydrocarbons left behind, but because it doesn't have the permeability, in particular the permeability, they're not going anywhere. And so fracking is how you make artificial porosity and permeability. And it's next slide. But that was, again, if we don't have the connections, let's engineer our way into having a connected, right, volume and get those hydrocarbons to flow into the well. Thanks to the U.S. Department of Energy. This is a rough timeline. It's pretty helpful for lots of details, but the main point is this wasn't new. But the way people put together different technologies that was earlier developed was new. So again, this one's just for gas, but gas did come first, and then they figured out they could also do it to rocks that had oil in them as well. So hydraulic fracturing back even to the 40s, where they actually did it on conventional wells, because again, they do have flowable hydrocarbons in those sandstones, but we can still make it faster, right? If we start fracturing. And so on starting on vertical wells, they did. And they said, well, this works. Well, we could, stimulate the entire reservoir in one of those, but around the well bore, you can increase the connectivity. And then the bigger advancement that also had to happen was better drilling and the ability to directional drill. So not drill just a straight well, but not even just a slant well, but to go full horizontal. And in that case, we added motors to the drill string so that you can, right, bend it and point it in the subsurface. I say we. I did not touch that part. That was my drillers. And they did a great job, except when they didn't. And then it was usually a case of, it's the geology's fault, it's the engineering's fault. We each had our differences there. One well, I do admit it was the geology's fault. The others I completely disputed. But at any rate, so the ability to drill that, your amount of area you could stimulate with fracking, right? Because the vertical well, right? If my reservoir layers say this thick, right? A vertical well, I'm only going to be able to get that. That might not be economic. If I can drill horizontal, right? I could go a mile, I could go 2 miles, I could go as long as my lease boundary lets me. Once we had the techniques for that. And then if you frack that volume, right, suddenly your rectangle is not just here, but you're stimulating a whole lot more rock, and that becomes a lot more favorable economics than vertical wells. So you needed both. You needed the ability to create your own porosity and permeability, and you needed the ability to drill sideways once you had a good source rock layer, and you could just keep drilling until you generally reach your lease boundary before you reach the end of the rock. Just think of the ocean, the deep ocean, where a lot of these organic material is accumulating and not being disturbed. That's a really regional, extensive formation. So you don't kind of have to worry about it pinching out very quickly because there's a lot of it. And so that did kind of develop the idea that as long as we had the rock, it didn't matter about the geology, we could engineer our way out of it. Doesn't quite work. You still need geologists. Yes.
Question. When you talk about horizontal drilling and a motor to aim the bit, if you will, it's metal, I assume, the drill casing or whatever it is. And so the radius must be quite large to get the metal to turn. I mean, how is it, is it some sort of composite that's different?
Nope.
It's okay. So it's just a big radius.
Usually they're in 30-foot strands you put together to have 90-foot is about what the rig can kind of have put together and go down the hole, and then you get another 90-foot strand and you send it down. And when you start to talk thousands of kilometers down, it's just to be like spaghetti as far as that. So yeah, you can, yes, the radius is not small. And that's is certainly a factor. And sometimes you would try to arrange it so that you actually drilled over into the neighboring lease, and as long as you got back into your lease when you got to the part where you would actually frack and produce. So you could maximize the difference by having the curve over there and somebody else. And usually if you had the adjoining lease, then they would drill the other way around and you could actually agree with it. Sometimes that didn't work. Sometimes we did it accidentally. And then you have to go cap in hand to the mineral owner and say, oops, I accidentally fracked on your property. I only had to do that. I didn't have to do that once, but my group had to do that once because they got the property line wrong. Yeah, but anyway, your point. Yes, it's drill pipe, and it's just when you're talking about that far down, it's not as stiff as you think, and it will curve if you give it a big enough. But that was a lot of the risk. Well, I have a better slide. I'll talk about there. I have a better picture where I can say it. So yeah, putting those together happened in the 90s and into the 2000s. And then the Barnett was in Texas was really the first one that was used extensively. So in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there's lovely, lovely geology exercise where you actually look at all the wells under the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. Because they did drill all underneath those wells and still producing. My parents lived there for a while and I think they got a whole $10 in the 5 years they lived there from the production that happened, you know, decades before they owned the house. Yep. So come back to the techniques second. I do want to talk about the Permian Basin. Yeah, it was mine. So we're in Texas, West Texas. So the Eagle Ford, if you've heard of that, that's much further south. So the Permian Basin up in the New Mexico border, and I was very close to the New Mexico border, such that sometimes it was shorter to go there than back to Midland. But it's kind of divided into two basins, the Delaware and the Midland, with a much different geologic province in the middle, separating those two kind of sub-basins. There was actually a little more reefs and things in those old oceans. And so then we got kind of two basins off to the side. It's much easier to see on a cross section, so I'll show that up. So this side was the Delaware, which is where I worked, and this side's the Midland Basin. And there were very different, you can see the very different thicknesses of the formations. So there's different sedimentology going on. There's different formations. So production is definitely not the same, although both of them have working formations. And this one that calls the Wolf Camp is what I primarily worked. Although there are, the Permian Basin is the basin keeps on giving. So that Wolf Camp formation would have been something like A up there with the early Permian. You can kind of see the outline of the basin, well, not really. So the kind of shoreline goes up into New Mexico and the platform. And so all the sediments were coming down from the north, and we can kind of track that back into New Mexico. Shell did not have acreage in New Mexico, so we mostly spied on ConocoPhillips and what they were doing and used some of those techniques in our leases across the state line. But again, that was, again, you need an ocean to get hydrocarbons. We had one at this time and definitely it got buried deep enough to produce those hydrocarbons and for the most part still be in the oil and gas window. Thickness map, 6,000 to 9,000 feet is the main takeaway from this slide. So these are well below the surface. It does get shallower in this red zones. That's largely where other formations are placed, not so much the Wolf Camp. And so that's quite deep, right? You think of your aquifers are much, much closer to the surface. So when people ask me, oh, are you concerned about that? And I went, no, not in the Permian Basin. They're so far below the surface.
Thank you.
Middle Pennsylvania. So these are geologic periods. So you can see the 345, the time in millions of years is the MA. So just again, this is when more of a limestone factory. So some of the older formations Middle Pennsylvania it got very restricted. You see more of the mountains surrounding it. And it was when we still had more of the limestones. You really got all the sands that make up our tight sands and some of the main shales up at the Permian period. So there are more things. Again, there's so many plays in the Permian Basin. You start to get quite deep and quite hot. So some more of these are played further east, where they're shallower. So you get on the edge of the basin, these come shallower, but they actually become, the source rocks got hotter. It's actually in the gas window over there. And that's actually because we had the Rio Grande Rift kind of heating up that side of the basin. So even though it's shallower and didn't get buried as much, it actually got hotter because we had a tectonic source of heat coming through that this part of the basin did not get. And so it stayed in the oil window. So it's the exact opposite of what I tell people is the deeper buried ones is in the gas. And then it gets the shallower ones in the oil window, except for here where we had a magmatic source of heat. But yeah.
I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I know there was a lot of fracking going on. How does it compare with other parts of the country, just in terms of just the magnitude of the fracking efforts?
So Pennsylvania is the geologic time period named after the state. So yeah, this is still Texas in all these slides, just at different.
Okay,
So 340 million years ago to 280 million years ago.
okay.
And the Pennsylvania period is named after Pennsylvania, the state.
But it doesn't have to do with the geography.
Yes. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, these are reconstructions, and I'm by Blakely, who's pretty much the king of reconstruction. So everybody uses his. So of course they are models. All models are wrong. Some are useful. And so these are, again, using a lot of the data, using a lot of the deep wells. So they're pretty well constrained out in this area where we have a lot of deep well data. But yeah, we were oceanic with a lot of kind of things popping up around us. But that was helpful because they give you an input to sediments and input of organic material. So same basin, but this is fun because it shows, maybe I use the mouse. No, but don't use the mouse. So here's Pennsylvania, which was in that. So here's that wolf camp, and there's A, B, C, and D. Shell had our own particular names for those. And so does every operator out there, but they usually don't share them of where we draw the lines. But that just tells you that all of these are looked at somewhere for hydrocarbons. So, and then some of the more deeper places where it's possible. And then there's the Bone Spring Horizon, which is also named after a time period. But that is more the tight sands versus the shale. So things migrated out of the Wolfcamp formation, and those are the sands with porosity but no permeability. So those were actually found first, and then they get deeper and found the Wolfcamp. Shell actually got the acreage from Chesapeake when Chesapeake exited, and they had produced a lot of those Bone Springs, and they said, we're giving you a played out asset. Well, then the Wolfcamp was found, and we were not, they weren't laughing anymore because that became actually more prolific than the Bone Springs formation. Just fun at oil and gas conferences. The Delaware up here is actually the conventional stuff. So that's all the stuff that was done in the 70s. And it's now where we stick all the wastewater. And then Lamar and things have the evaporates and various other formations. So again, the 70s found this one, and then we found this one, and we found this one, and we're still working down here. So it really is in that way the basin that keeps on giving because they keep finding more things, more sandstones and more shales to exploit. Which is unusual. Other basins, I don't think of even other unconventional basins, just to have that many producing formations is unusual. The Marcellus has it a little bit with the Utica, and there's another one out there, but this kind of 3 is about its limit, and they're not nearly as good as the Marcellus. Don't shell that. They disagree with me, but I so this is it's completions, so that just means number of wells fracked in those formations, but they have to publicly report. So a lot of the reporting is done by depth, and so you kind of have to do your permit for your completions based on what formation, what level you're going to frack. So you have to publicly announce that, and then everybody spies on everybody else announcing that in the records to try to figure out who's playing what. And you can see the Wolfcamp by far, goes only to 2019. So that's probably still that's the case. And then, yeah, some of those other formations in comparison. Just another graphic that kind of shows, again, a Bone Spring well, Avalon well, which is kind of higher up, Wolfcamp, and then this doesn't even have the deeper Wolfcamp formations. So you could potentially drill all of these from one surface pad. Generally, the drilling engineers don't like to leave the rig on for that long to get that many wells drilled. They want to produce some of them, but so it's a balancing act of how many wells you drill versus how much production you can handle all at one time. Got that very wrong on some of my wells. They actually produce way better than we thought they were, which is a lovely problem to have, except when they were shut in because they wouldn't have the capacity in the pipelines to get it out. So I was very sad about that. But I digress. So these are the plays in the US. Not all of them are actively being worked. But this is why fracking has been so influential, because we have a lot. And so the Barnett here in Fort Worth, this was the first one. Eagleford was not far after, and there's been a lot of, does Mexico have any? Right, because the formation doesn't necessarily stop at the country boundary, right? Although that's not the safest part of Mexico to be doing things. So the Appalachian to the Marcellus is not just Pennsylvania, it's kind of regional. We didn't have the best position in the Marcellus, I'd say, but there are a couple of other layers to that one. The Bakken is probably, again, one of the biggest up in the Dakotas up there, the top, and then there's very small ones in the Rockies. Those are the main ones that I know that are active. Shell did not have a position in the Bakken, so that one I know the least about. Even though it's a fantastic one, we just didn't have a position there.
I can't quite read the legend, but it looks like the state of Michigan is kind of red.
Kinda.
Does that mean that there's fracking going on in Michigan, or it might, or what does that mean?
Very little that I know of. That says the Antrim play is there. I'm a little skeptical of how this is a 2011 map. So I have not, as far as I know, they haven't updated it. I've looked because I want an updated one. So I think they certainly tried it, but I certainly haven't heard much that really came of it. And I've seen other maps, if less official, that really shrink it to a lot more to kind of the northern part of Michigan and not the whole state. So I think they were maybe looking at this a little rosy when they called the Antrim sale. And I know we were investigating the Haynesville when I worked at Shell, but there really wasn't much going on there. But it was certainly being kind of tested. But so some of them are, they say they're current, but that sometimes is current evaluation instead of current production. And yes, they were, I think, trying to make it look particularly hopeful. I know they even have the Kansas play on there. They kind of have the Kansas. That was a disaster, at least as far as Shell's acreage was concerned. Everybody who worked it was before I joined the company. They didn't put it on their CV. And that was the case of, well, again, it was not good rock. And they said, well, if we just frack it hard enough, we'll be able to get something out of it. And that does not work. So there's a limit to what you can engineer your way out. And that's where geologists said, yes, you still need us. And we weren't the only ones who learned that lesson in that play. And I don't even think most people admit that it was one for now. So there were certainly ones that were tried and it just, even with fracking, not prolific enough. And a lot of the unconventionals, it really does matter what piece of the play you have. If you're not in what they call the sweet spot, you struggle to make it economic, and especially the majors, because that was my perspective, struggle because we've got ridiculous overheads, which the more independents can usually do a little better than us. And that was always a big debate with us. So should we stay in the unconventionals? Should we spin it off? As I worked there, I wanted us to keep it, but we did eventually sell our Permian acreage after I stopped working it. But it is a marginal play because you get your production is much smaller over a longer time, but you have to keep investing. You have to keep drilling wells. You have to keep fracking. And so unlike kind of a conventional play where you invest all your money up front and then you get all your production with, you drilling some occasional additional wells later, but much more episodic on the kind of investment return front. Whereas the unconventionals drags it out because you drill one well, you put it on production, and you drill more and more wells and you put them all in production. So your spending gets dragged out, but so does your production. And you'll never get as much return as you will with rock that you don't have to stimulate, because you can flow more hydrocarbons in a rock that you don't have to create artificial permeability on. So you can only do that to a limited amount around the wellbore, which we pretend we know what that distance is. And so that's never going to be as much production. But it's onshore, it's shallower wells, it's cheaper wells. You don't have as much risk because you're so tight that, nothing is flowing back up your well most of the time. So, yep. So horizontal well. Again, how deep varies a lot from basin to basin. The Delaware Basin, the Permian Basin, we were quite deep. The Marcellus is generally quite deep. You do have to worry about all the Appalachian faults. They can also go quite close to the surface. So there's additional risk when you have a lot of faults already in the rock, because some of them might go up to the surface and your fluids might go along that up to the surface. So about that, the risk. But the Permian was tectonically active much longer ago than even the Appalachians. So I encountered a fault. There were faults all over the basin. We mostly didn't even notice them as we drilled through them, except once. That was the one well that I admit the geology was a problem. We hit something as we were crossing the fault, some sort of mineralization cemented up in it, and kicked our drill bit off at an angle that we could not recover from. It was while we were drilling the curve section, and we had to stop, cement back up, and then restart our curve because we just got knocked too far off course. So I admit, yeah, I read that one. It's geology. My engineer's like, that happened right on the fault. And then, yeah, it did. Sure.
I assume you know what the rock layers are there in advance because of the sonic echoes that you've monitored, and you can tell the different permeability levels and everything to some degree. But how in the world do you know where the drill bit is once it starts curving?
So, yes and no. Short answer. We do know the layers pretty well, but usually, at least in the Permian Basin, so seismic helps for some basins because we have those evaporites up at the very shallow section. It actually screws with the skin wall. So mostly what we use is other wells where they've logged the well bore. And you have massive fence diagrams across this basin just connecting all the wells, and that does a good enough job, except when it surprises you, which occasionally happens. But yes, you're kind of making a prediction based on correlating from well to well, what layers are there. And so that matters because, of course, you're drilling down to the kickoff point. You have to set this point, right? If you keep going and you start to realize your formations are coming in shallow or steep, it's much harder to correct at that point. If it's deeper, we usually can, but as a consequence, you end up out here and you have less stages you can frack. Whereas if it gets shallower, you might have to stop and, cement back and restart the well if you're really off. That's not a fun conversation to have with a drilling engineer. So you do, but usually for all of mine, again, it was very layer cake. It didn't have a lot of offsets. Some of the folks who played the Bone Springs, that was a lot more of a concern because those could thicken and thin those sands layers a lot more than the Wolf Camp, which was a very boring shale. If you saw it in core, it's like black. So, yes. And how do we know where we are? We know what angle we've told it to do, and we know how far we go from the starting points. And so it's again of, if I drilled at this angle for this distance and then this angle at this distance. So there's no GPS on it, unfortunately, but just, calculations of, again, how far you've gone, at what angle, this is where you must be.
So, and you also mentioned about it kicking you off. So with the drill bit, are there certain substances or types of rock that you can't penetrate, or do you, like you said, it throws you off? I mean, how does that happen? Then, there's certain situations where we got to go around it or whatever. I mean, how does that happen? Does that make
It's
sense?
rare. And in part it was because we were starting our angle. And so, but we had diamond beds, right? The diamonds. Again, we could chew through it, is how fast you are going to go. And that in case when it was easier to get deflected is trying to build that curve. Or when you're in the horizontal, you could get, if you just hit something a little bit harder. So it was more a case of you couldn't drill through it, but it didn't want to. It wants to go over here where it's softer. So it was more of a deflection thingamajig that you could get kind of kicked off of course. And then it was a dialogue between the geologist and the engineer of how much do you let it wander and how much do you try to stay in the target box. And geologist who's being counted in their metrics for performance on production wants to be in a pretty tight target. The drilling engineer's metric was how fast they could drill the well. Obviously, these are in opposition from each other because when you're steering, you're going slower. And so it was a not necessarily fun debate, particularly at 2 a.m., where you're trying to decide how much you're going to try to enforce steering. And of course, if you really can't get back into the target box, that could damage the bit. And then you'd have to take a whole nother trip out of the well, repair it and go back down. That's adding a day. So it was a give and take. It would love bentonite beds. It flew through them. Our completions engineers who did the fracking hated them because it would dampen the fracks. So there was that. And the geologist got to be the middleman for that debate. It's not fun. So it was, it's more of a how much you steer, how much you let it walk.
What is the material that comprises the drill bit?
So it's got the diamonds on the I don't have a picture of it, sorry. It was more like grinding, but yeah, yes, thank you. So artificial, but the teeth that would, again, and you're shooting the cuttings along with the drill mud kind of back up the string and out on the pad. And that's how your geologist on site would be looking through those and determining what formation you're in based on what cuttings are coming out. Do they see the sands at the right time? Do they see the shales? Yeah.
I realize that's a conceptual diagram, but in real life, what's the radius of curvature of your curve? How gentle is the turning?
I'm not going to remember that number. I'm sorry.
Is it in miles or feet or
Feet.
yards? It's in feet.
Well, not miles, because your lease might be a mile long. So yeah.
Oh.
No, I'm not gonna remember this. Yep, nope, not gonna remember the numbers.
Back to my question about knowing where the drill bit is. You monitor a bunch of old wells around it and so you have a 3D model of where the sound is coming from. Are you actually monitoring the sound of the drill bit itself? What are you monitoring?
Oh, that would be pre-drill to kind of get a model of the subsurface and where you think the layers should be. But during the drill, it's just the engineer keeping track of, again, how deep we've gone, at what angle.
And at what angle? Okay, thank you.
Oh, this just, again, why horizontal and not vertical, right? You can see pretty nicely that you get a lot more exposure that you can frack with a horizontal well. So when you get really fancy and get multi-well pads, this would be kind of what you can do. Shell was starting to do this as I was leaving, where you would park a rig on a site and you would drill this direction and you would drill that direction. And you could get 3 to 4, right? So you would have to then, you wouldn't be straight up and down, but you'd be drilling to the side, to drill over here, and then this one, and then this one, and then you would drill the lease on the other side. So you might have a rig there for quite a long time while you drilled 4, 6 wells, 8 wells. This is assuming just one target horizon, because then you start to worry, well, if you want multiple target horizons. We started to do also what you call come and go pads, where they would kind of set up the pad so that you could bring a rig back to it. Normally, you can't do that because there's not enough space once the production assembly is on existing wells to bring a rig back and drill more. You'd have to build an extension to the pad. Well, they started to and then you negotiate with the surface owner again. He asked for more money. So they started to do what's called a come and go pad, where you would have, okay, we're going to drill 4 wells now and come back and drill 4 wells later. And they would have it all set up for you to do that. So you could at least only negotiate that part once. But then it really started to help, because rigging down and rigging back up for just a single well, right? That's a lot of time lost to taking apart the rig, moving it, setting it back up. So we can sit there and drill, 4, 6 wells. That takes away that bit. But again, the con is then you get a lot of production all at once, which if you didn't size your facilities right, might be a problem. So we were going to more of this model, and certainly it has since I've left. If the target can support it. One of the reasons not to do this was if you needed to move the rig off somewhere else because the lease was expiring, maybe you would drill fewer wells. So it's kind of a balancing act between how many leases you needed to hold, and then how much, which would be the most efficient way to reduce the horizon versus, what maybe the non-technical reasons to do otherwise. So. I should probably start speeding up a little bit. Completions. So completions is what we would call fracking. So the drill rig's gone at this point. They've drilled a well, they've cased it off, they've put cement around the casing, and they've left. And then at some point, which might be really soon or it might be sometime later, the completions team would come in and get ready to frack the well. And so it's a big operation. That's probably the more truck traffic than drilling. This is actually this is not from Permian, but it's a small operation, I would say. We usually had more trucks than this. But you've got to have the sands that you will stick down the well. You've got to have all the water, which if you were really lucky, you could pipe that. Most of ours, you had to truck that out into the middle of nowhere on dirt roads. And those trucks are heavy and they tore the roads up pretty good too. So yeah, there's a lot of traffic that comes with fracking, which is one of the cons people really dislike about it. These parts here, these are the actual pumps to put that water down at pressure in the well. where's the wellhead's actually right here, and this is the kind of up in the air, and you would send the guns down the well with that. So you don't have a drill rig generally, you just had that truck. And so kind of example of what would be in case and what are they doing? Well, those people, this is vertical well, but just pretend it's a horizontal one. So first, right, we've put casing and cement in. How do we get the water back into the formation? So we had to blow holes into that casing that we've just made. So that's kind of the perforation step. So they would send the perf guns. Generally, it's the perf guns. That's the easiest method to do it with. And again, basically blow holes in both the casing, but also a little ways into the formation. And that kind of helps the fluid get out in there and make more conductivity. There is another method to do it is when they put the casing down this well, instead of making it solid, they had it with sleeves that you could open. Later, you send down balls and there's knock the sleeves open, so you could have pre-made holes. Rarely did we use this. Occasionally when the research team wanted to try a new fracking technique, and they always wanted to do it on my wells, which I didn't want because it affected production if their technique didn't work as promised, which was the time. So occasionally they would do those fancy sleeves because they didn't want to send perf guns down and mess up all their data collection. So that is a way you could do it where, again, you kind of have, you can think of it as like shutters on a window, and you could send balls down into the thing and it would open those windows. At least it was supposed to. Didn't always work. So the fancier method, but again, perf guns most of the time is what we do.
So when you drill the well and you case it with cement, do you case the entire distance?
Yes, that may be the slide I took out. But yes, you usually have multiple strings of casing. So there'll be a couple around the surface to block the aquifer access into your well. And then you would have one in that the whole vertical distance, you would have usually an intermediate string of casing. So above kickoff point. And then you would, different designs will have different types of kind of casing for the curve and the horizontal bit. But yeah, that would have the smallest diameter and probably only one string of casing, whereas then the vertical can be protected by 2 or 3 at that point.
Thank you.
I had one well. My engineers were having trouble getting the cement because you pour the cement down the middle of the well and then you circulate it out behind the casing, so then it's between the casing and the rock. They got the timing wrong for hardening the cement. So the cement hardened in the well bore that we had just drilled instead of around the backside of the casing, and we had to drill the well all over again. That was not a fun conversation to have with management, but it was not my fault. But it was a beautiful well. It was one of the straightest we'd ever drawn. The replacement was not. So always happens that time. So once you do the perforations, right, take the perf guns back out. And that's when you add the fluid, the frac fluid, and the fluid then goes out, right? It helps out of these holes that you've put, perforated, and into the formation. And this is a quite high pressures. And so you're fracturing, you're above the strength of the shale. And so you're creating more fractures in it, hence the fracking. And those will tend to close, which is why we also pump sand down there with the water so that the sand gets in the crack and props it open so that the hydrocarbons can still flow into your wellbore. Otherwise, they just kind of close back up, and that's wasted frac job. And there's been all sorts of fancy experiments to try to save different fluids and different proppants. And do we do fancy ceramic or we just do sand? And I'll say probably the conclusion that I certainly came to was the fancy stuff did no better a job than the cheap stuff. And everybody for a while was spying on EOG in the Permian Basin because you could also had to report what you were pumping down the well, the Texas Railroad Commission rules. And we were, oh, they're doing this proppant and they're doing this, and maybe there's a special technique. And colleague of mine actually finally talked to someone from EOG, and they said, no, we own our own mines. So we're just chucking in whatever they send us. And all of us who are buying our proppant special is like, oh, okay, there wasn't a strategy to that. No. So sometimes the competitive buying gave you really the wrong idea. But at any rate, what really was pressure, the higher the pressure, you did get the better production because the more fracks you were creating. So the higher the pressure and higher the rate really were king as far as parameters, right? The research department did their best to find fancy ways of doing it. And they did, to be fair, try also to find low water ways of doing it for potentially moving into areas that are, look at places in Africa, the water is very scarce. You don't want to use it for fracking. Is there a low water way we could frack? And I think my conclusion to that was no. At least the method they tried on one of my mills failed horribly. So I'm not going to remember the numbers. I'm sorry. So the frac fluid, yep. We'll come back. But what is it? Most of it's water and proppant. So that together is 99% or more. So you get a lot of concern about chemicals. They're less than 1% of the total volume. Now a lot of that volume comes back out as soon as you stop pumping water. Some of that, as well as hydrocarbons, will flow back out of the well to the surface, and you collect it for disposal or recycling. Some of it does stay behind in the formation. So you also see concerns about where is it going. But again, we're well below aquifer for most of these basins. Only reason I've seen things get to the surface could be a fault. The fault is open that connects to the surface. The one I know about that happened, this was in the Marcellus play. There's a lot of really old wells in Pennsylvania, and of course, not all of them were mapped. I think not all of them were legal. A lot of them were improperly abandoned, particularly when people took like the metal out for recycle it for during wars. So there was a well that was improperly abandoned. I think they just chucked junk down it, whoever did it. And it wasn't even on our records and wasn't on the maps. And the frac fluid did connect with it. It wasn't that close, but it was there and it connected through the subsurface. And then there was just sort of a geyser going off in the middle of the forest. Somebody reported it to us, and then we did kind of have to go in and take care of that. But that was the one case I know of that it did come back up to the surface. But that was actually through an artificial, a badly sealed off well. So it certainly can happen, especially if things are not done properly. So it can do, but it's certainly if you do it properly, it's quite difficult, and especially in the things like the Permian Basin, you're that deep underground. I'd be more worried about the integrity of the well bore through the aquifer formation, as long as you have, maybe an extra string of casing. And we had surface owners who required us to put an extra string of casing in for their comfort, and we did it because that was a lot cheaper than fighting it. So but for the frac fluid to get all the way up there would be difficult. But certainly in basins where, well, in Pennsylvania, where you have a lot of things that aren't marked and recorded, and you have a lot of those Appalachian faults. Still puzzled about that earthquake that cracked the Washington Monument. Like, where did that come from? My sister heard about that. I was like, there's no tectonic activity over there. But anyway, faults. That's another talk. So, yep, proppant. Here's an example. Again, just the proppant going into the fractures, highly size exaggerated. Chemicals. It's been a bunch of debates in Congress and courts and things about, do you have to report? Canada does. The kind of ending points and what subsequent court decisions seem to have gone back to is the 2005 Act, where they left it to the states. Later administrations did require it for federal lands. So drilling on federal lands, you have to do it. Several states do require it. And several companies report it even if they're not required because they're tired of tired of the debate. So Shell just voluntarily reports, even when they don't have to. The Texas is one state where you do. So there's generally several websites that publish this information about what chemicals. Early on in this, that was a lot more concern about keeping things proprietary because of potential advantages. And again, my take on it is those weren't really advantages. I think that, again, the game changer is more fluid. And so it was a bigger attempt to keep some of this proprietary for competitive advantage. And I think the conclusion was it's not. That's based in Canada, but a lot of US companies report there as well, kind of go in and see what chemicals they're putting down there, what they might do, what they're for. A lot of them, again, friction reducers, biocides don't like microbes growing in your well and munching on your hydrocarbons, preventing buildup in your pipes, corrosion inhibitors. So lots of bits. And again, all of it comes to less than 1% generally. Some of the stuff is kind of nasty, so I wouldn't want a surface leak, right? Would want to make sure that's cleaned up properly. If you did have a problem with your casing up in the well near the aquifers, I definitely then want to track and make sure it didn't get into aquifers. But that's, again, that's failures of design, or sometimes improperly done. You don't have cement that gets across your casing. As it is, right? It shouldn't do it, but sometimes it does. So the question?
Yes, regardless of what the pressure is down there, 3,000 meters down or whatever, the pressure you have to deliver has to exceed that in order to get it to spread out. And are some of the chemicals used, are they chosen to dissolve some of the rock as they're forced outward?
You can put acid, more if it's a limestone or has limestone cement, maybe, to get a little bit more permeability. I mean, even rainwater is naturally slightly acidic and will dissolve limestone, so it doesn't have to be like a super acid. Again, depends on the rock, whether you would want to chuck that down, but it is one thing that can be included.
This is certainly a novice question, but when we're talking about hauling this down there with pressure, how far out from the well itself are you ranging?
That's the lovely, lovely $1 million question. We have estimates, but they're guesses. And usually the only way you can check is if you drill another well next to it, and if you start losing your drilling mud, then you're like, oh, I'm connecting up with the fractures that I already went through. That's a lot of what's the, if you heard of microfracking, a microseismic, they try to do is put seismometers down and set off, again, something equivalent of perforation gun types, and try to track sort of at the very small seismic level, much smaller than you would do for a big survey, how far those are going. They're fascinating studies. We never got approval to do it. It's more like, just drill it. The Canadians did. And so they're, yeah, I don't have a great round number for you because it was very the type of completion, sometimes just the individual rock layers. We did have parts of the Wolf Camp that seemed to frack better than others. So then you try to get your driller to steer in a smaller box, and he didn't like that very much. But yeah, so it hundreds of feet is kind of order of magnitude that we think. But it is not something we really know for sure. And you tried to get that right. Certainly one of my leases, we had one of our first wells in the area that had been producing for a while, and it was our star producer. blew the type curve out of the water. It was like, that's way better than we were expecting. Didn't usually have that problem. And so then we drilled another one next to it. And we definitely saw influence as we were drilling it. So that's when we were like, okay, the fracks did go that far. It was kind of 4 per lease, which doesn't help you very much. So you could, if you had a time delay between when you drilled the horizontal, sometimes you could tell that you had reached the frac envelope. You generally tried not to do that so that you could stimulate more rock and space them out wider. But that was one of the main things we would often try to figure out, what spacing is appropriate for this formation, this part of the formation. A lot of what I did was single wells, where we're still trying to figure out what targets worked in the area. And then we were starting to drill the multi-well pads as I left, where we figured out what target, and then we were working on what spacing. And so we were doing trials with, again, 3 wells per section, 4 wells per section, 5 wells per section, to determine, right, what was the optimal, how much were we doing where we were stimulating all the rock versus leaving production in the ground. But yeah, I'm very sorry.
Hi, first of all, good job on explaining fracking. I didn't know what it was. I know that it is a controversial issue, and I hope that maybe you plan on going into that, but that's the things that I've gotten so far is lots of traffic, at a well site, and damage to the roads. I've got the fracking fluid could come to the surface. I mean, there's a chance, and there's lots of chemicals in it. But are there other things that that people who say they are anti-fracking need to know?
Yeah. So I'll skip ahead a little bit because I'm going slower than I thought I would. Why? What is the controversy? We'll start with the positives. Why do we like it? And that's really, it's kind of, I said, economics versus environments is kind of the debate. And that's not one-sided, like good and one-sided bad. It's kind of good and bad on both sides of that argument. But a lot of the argument for it, of course, is more fossil fuels, more domestic fossil fuels, less imports from geopolitically not so stable places. Energy security kind of lumps that whole argument together. So there's a lot of verbiage basically saying that. Also doing it domestically, more jobs. So those are the big ones, jobs, security. And then I'll also say, again, we've become a net exporter, which we hadn't. That's completely based on conventionals, because we were definitely a net importer for a very long time. So that's not by a lot. We still import a lot, but especially with gas, that we have more gas than we know what to do with. So exporting that's special. So I'll talk about that. But yeah, it's certainly changed. It did a 180 for us as far as energy security and domestic supply and all of that. Yeah, lots of graphs. You can see this whole slope with oil and gas. This turnaround is the unconventionals. That's the fracking. I will say conventionals is, doing its thing, but not a step change increase like that. Yeah, so we're producing more than we're consuming. Yay. And again, we finally, a couple years ago, became a net exporter. We were a net importer for most of that. Doesn't mean we still import a lot, but yep. And yep, oil production, of course, this doesn't have gas on it, but you can see we passed Russia. So this is a little bit more future casting. You can see we're kind of right here, but the Permian is special because it's oil, but a lot of those other plays are gas. But gas is a lot, you can stick a pipeline to Canada and Mexico, but otherwise you can't ship it across the sea and not in gas form. And so LNG is liquefied natural gas. So if you put it under a lot of pressure, you can force it into the liquid state and you can export that. And so there's been a lot of investments about making these LNG plants. So making these where we can, and it was not an easy debate about was that going to happen, where is it going to happen, but we are building a lot of capacity to export our gases that have done a lot to make domestic prices right, but it's been hard to export unless you're going to the people we're actually connected with. And there's been some controversy over those pipelines that you've probably heard about. So at any rate, well, I dislike it. The kind of main concerns: greenhouse gas emissions, water, water and pollution. I'd probably merge those. Earthquakes, induced earthquakes. So obviously, I'll go through this pretty quick, but we're adding carbon dioxide, right? This is ice core data, and this is the normal natural cyclicity connected to the solar system dynamics. And this is where we are. Geologic past, like well behind here, we have definitely been higher, but this is man-made. An additional spike on top of that. And that's, again, burning fossil fuels adds that carbon from the rock reservoir to the atmosphere at a rate much faster than naturally it will go back the other way. So we're sort of artificially speeding up one half, but not doing anything to put the other half. Carbon capture and storage does attempt to do that, and that's an attempt to course correct going back into the buried reservoir, but there's that. So there's actually pro-fracking arguments for this. They said, well, especially natural gas, it has less of those pollutants than coal. So it's greener, if not green. And therefore, if we're replacing coal with domestic natural gas, right, we're at least lessening the problem, if not reducing it, or eliminating it. And electricity generation, right? So if you look at the emissions gains, which have decreased our emissions quite a lot in this country, and most of that's in the power generation switch. It's not on the individual level, but it's at the switch of electricity more towards natural gas. Also, the renewables play their own role. Sizably, though, it's natural gas. So, but it is still fossil fuel, so we still is some emissions. Although there is the ability to do no emission natural gas power plants. And I always like to pitch that to my students of, if it's fossil fuels, but you're not doing any emissions, are you okay with that? And it gets some interesting conversations going. But those are few, those power plants. Yep, that's just, again, showing the switchover. So we've got... well, coal is the brown one. So decreasing. So that one, again, the kind of debates on the emissions is, well, we're still emitting with this, we should switch to something with no emissions. And then the other side is, but it's better. So there's that one. Yep.
You mentioned that some electricity generation can be done in an emissions-free with natural gas. Do you know whether the award-winning energy park here in Holland is one of those, or is it close to that? It's not.
The one I know about is in Texas. They built a pilot plant, and I think they were going to scale it up after it's demonstrated that they can do it. One of the problems with it is not retrofittable onto existing power plants. So you have to build it that way. There are other ways with carbon capture and storage that can sort of be retrofit on some things, but yeah, it's also a bit location dependent that so. But yeah, as far as I know, it's not. That's a very wordy slide, mostly because that's all EPA documents, because kind of the pollution debate in the continents there was a 2004 study by the APA that said, it's not a problem. We're not contaminating our drinking water. People didn't like that. And so they restudied it. And in 2016, they came out with what I find one of the most unhelpful reports ever. That said, yes, some of those chemicals are bad for you. We knew that. And then it said, yes, the potential is there to pollute. And they said kind of again, there's the scarcity problem. If you're running out of water for drinking, you shouldn't be using it for industry. Fair. It says if you spill things on the surface in the middle of doing this, obviously you're not supposed to, but if you spill it, right, you could contaminate. Yes. And then they said if there's mechanical problems in the wellbore, like the casing's not good, it could leak out of that. And it's like, yes, okay. I mean, obviously you don't plan on making a mechanical failure in your well, but yes, it could. And then they said wastewater. If you don't treat the wastewater properly, if you don't dispose of it properly, it could leak. Yes. But it's all like, these are failures of the process, in which case tighten the regulations, maybe. It was, so I did not like it because it was kind of, the report was saying the natural process, yes, should not have any of these, but certainly they happen. We know that. So it was unhelpful. And then there was a lot of people wanting to know, is like, well, is it happening? And they said, we don't have data for that. There was a couple of case studies where they had not seen it in any groundwater wells. They'd seen it in some monitoring wells after like a big spill on the surface. I think there's one case that they cited, but it didn't actually get to the drinking wells. They did remediate it. So, and there was a lot of questions you can read in the Q&As after this report came out. And it was like, well, how many cases have happened? And they said, well, we can't talk to that. And so I certainly see this get used a lot because it kind of said, yes, the potential's there and we think it might happen, but we can't say that it has happened. Well, what's the conclusion of that report? So people have used it on multiple, they've used it to say whatever they want to say, basically. As far as I know, I mean, there was kind of like a, let's continue working it, but I don't know what the state of it is after that. So it's still kind of out there nebulous that people claim it's happened. There's certainly academic studies that said we have seen it. There's people arguing with the rigor of those studies. So I don't have a consensus for this myself.
Has there been any effort to clean the water after use for drilling? And is that practical?
Sometimes. Especially to recycle some of the frack water and use it on another well. That certainly that was in the works. And it has been done to some extent. Some of it you can't, but some of it you can. And we do try it. There was at least conceptual thoughts of cleaning it up to the point where you could, I think, use it for agricultural use. They were debating like sending it over to Arizona or something. I don't think they ever did it. I know they didn't, but there was certainly discussion. One of the things is the surface owners in Permian, they get tariffs for things that go across pipelines. We go across. Canada owned their own, but we had to pay for in the Permian. And when we started talking about recycling and laying pipelines to get that to a central recycle frack facility, they started wanting tariffs for that, and it made it uneconomic to recycle it. So I don't know where that debate went, but that was part of the struggle, was people kept kind of making it too expensive to recycle. But generally how we dispose of it is that those old Delaware formations where we've taken all the oil and gas out, we put wastewater back in because those formations have proven to have a seal. However, the rate at which they do that has been known to fracture the rock. So they're basically fracking a formation that they don't intend to, that should already have porosity and permeability. And that's exactly where the earthquakes come in. Earthquakes and induced seismicity, there's a few cases that have known to happen with fracking. None that I know of in the Permian Basin. Our Canadian colleagues, there seems to be in a couple that were in seismically already active areas. And in general, the magnitude for fracking is much, much less, but it did seem to hook up with an already stressed rock. I'd be curious to see the data from China because that's a very tectonically active area. Didn't share as much, those colleagues. So I don't have as much information about that, but most of the induced seismicity that you hear about with fracking is not from the fracking, it's from the disposal of the frack fluid, where that's an example of just a well, a disposal well. It looks like nothing on the surface, but they're sending all the wastewater in to go pump it back underground. And this is why Oklahoma has more earthquakes than California. Those aren't natural. Those are from wastewater disposal. And that's really, Shell was always kind of like, we're not in charge of that. We're selling the frack water to the third party who's disposing of it. Their whole profit comes from how much water can we stuff into the subsurface, how fast. So they were doing the maximum allowable rates, whether or not those were the geologically should allowable rates. And they saw the first induced earthquake, induced seismicity. Again, these are usually not felt, but Oklahoma's gone up some magnitude 5 and 1s, but it's not a good sign when you start to see those. And it was centered completely around the disposal wells. So we do know, and you could see in the Oklahoma data, when you shut off those disposal wells, the earthquake could drop. You turn this back on, it goes back up. So Shell was petitioning the Railroad Commission, which was the governing body in Texas, to change the allowed rates of disposal. Now it's a little bit of a self-serving argument because you get blamed for the seismicity, even though you don't have anything to do with it, but you also are not making your profit from it. So, but on the other hand, it was fracking the formations. And so that disposal well, I do argue that should be a little more stricter regulated, and they certainly in states that have seen it have been trying to do that, because that is almost all of the seismicity that goes with fracking. Very, very little of it is from the fracking. It's all from the disposal of the wastewater. Yes.
I've been waiting 89 minutes to ask this question because it probably went right over my head and I just didn't understand it. So it's another novice question. When you had the material slide up on the involved in fracking, you had water at 95%, 4% fracking materials, and then other all added up to 100%. So I got that 100%. But I don't understand, where's the oil and gas come from and how is it captured? Maybe you said that, but I missed it. So the fracking will lead to you netting gas and oil, but what's the process for it captures it? Does it push it to that heavy intensity of water pressure? You know, where does the oil and gas come from? How is it captured as a result of the frack?
So it's locked up in the rock, but it's not flowable on its own. So it's in the shale, but it can't leave the shale. There's no permeability for it to do so. So the fluid does go out into the formation, and then as soon as you stop pumping, it flows back and it brings the hydrocarbons with it, particularly the gas fields, because gas flows, very easily. And so it'll go back up the wellbore because you've basically just made it a flowable formation. And as soon as you get the water out, or as most of it that will come out, the hydrocarbons can now flow through those fractures, and will, as long as the well's open. So usually the completions team will close it off at that point, and they'll take all their equipment and leave, and the production folks will come on and install kind of the permanent producing wellhead, and either hook it up to pipelines, or a lot of cases we couldn't put pipelines out, and so we just truck it. We had oil. It's a little different with gas. You do need a pipeline. Yeah, you take the tanks and usually take it to a separate facility, kind of clean it up as much you can, and then send the stuff you can't clean up to disposal, and then the rest of it usually on to the next well.
Did any of your experiences with the oil company lead to academic publications here at Hope?
No. Certainly there's plenty of folks at Shell who did publish. Usually in the research groups, the asset teams were a little too busy We go to conferences sometimes. A lot of it was the unconventionals conferences, not the big academic conferences. I have certainly brought some of that research, more of the Gulf of Mexico stuff I did after this. I haven't written it up for publication yet. So yeah, there's certainly plenty of good stuff out there, especially when they were exploring a lot of this. They don't encourage the asset teams to publish the way they do the research teams, because usually we want to keep those secrets or until we sell the acreage to somebody else and, you know, run. So that did tend to be, you get in as quickly as you will, figure out whether you have the good acreage or the bad acreage, figure it out fast enough that you can sell it to a sucker if you had the bad spot where they think it's valuable and you get out. We held on to things sometimes too long in Shell. That was an acknowledged fault of the company sometimes. And in unconventionals, you can't do that. You've got to figure out, do I have the good spot? If not, give it away. Well, it's still valuable and we get out or get a different acreage position. We actually had an excellent acreage position in the Permian. The problem is we couldn't get any more because the prices went so high and it was so competitive at that time. It did peak then. And so we just couldn't have enough acreage to keep sustaining problems. So they did eventually sell it off to ConocoPhillips, who already had the New Mexico acreage, so they added ours to it.
Yeah, Sarah, if I might interrupt, it is 2:30, and if
Yep.
any of you do need to leave, you may do so. Otherwise, Sarah, you can carry on.
Yeah, I covered most of it, but we are unique in that minerals are private. And that's why it works in this country. I think in most other countries, minerals are owned by the government. And there is far less incentive for the locals to allow or not protest or not raise a fuss over fracking than there is when private, you might get the royalties. And so I really think that's why it works. The other places it tends to work are very isolated population areas. Like in Argentina, it's a very sparsely populated where it actually works. Same with Canada. And so a lot of Europe that's investigated it, and the backlash, especially in very densely populated areas who just don't want it going on, and they're not going to get anything for it because the minerals are owned by the government. So that's, I think, why it works so well in this country and why it doesn't in most others, is there's a lot of investments by the property owners, the mineral owners, the way we just don't have in other countries.
Is there any fracking going on in the Middle East and the oil producers there?
No, as far as I know. Why would they? They've got such fantastic conventional reservoirs. It's sort of, yeah, you've already got a giant slice of the pie. Certainly, yeah, Europe's explored it because again, they're not greats in resources, a lot of those countries. But again, especially the UK has explored it quite extensively, and the public backlash was so severe, they've banned it. Yeah, and the PR around it just fails sometimes, for not necessarily scientific reasons. China does do it more because, well, different governments, still owned by the governments and densely populated, but they go ahead with it. They've got a very different tectonic situation, which can make it a very different prospect over there. We tried it. Shell had a little bit of a position there for a little while. And the holes kept collapsing because the orientation with the existing stress field would just close them back up. So I know they do produce it. So we didn't figure it out, but somebody has. But a lot of countries, yeah, don't do it or have banned it, even if they might have the resources. The UK certainly has the resources.